Have you ever been in a situation where you knew you absolutely, positively could not laugh, but your brain decided that was the perfect moment to find everything hilarious? You know that feeling when your best friend whispers something ridiculous in your ear during the most serious moment of your life, and suddenly you're fighting a battle between your common sense and your funny bone? Well, imagine if that moment wasn't just any serious occasion. Imagine it was your wedding day, standing at the altar with 200 guests watching, your bride looking radiant, and the pastor asking the most important question of your life. Now imagine your best man, who you've known since childhood, choosing that exact sacred moment to remind you of the most embarrassing thing that ever happened to you in high school. This is the story of Marcus Thompson, a 28-year-old accountant from Ohio, whose perfect wedding day turned into a comedy disaster thanks to his lifelong friend Danny, and how one moment of uncontrollable laughter nearly cost him his marriage before it even began. But sometimes the worst moments create the best memories, and what seemed like a complete catastrophe became the foundation of something even more beautiful than Marcus ever imagined. What you're about to read really happened. Every embarrassing detail, every moment of panic, every consequence that followed. Because sometimes truth really is stranger and funnier than fiction. Marcus Thompson had planned everything down to the last detail. After 2 years of engagement to his college sweetheart Sarah Mitchell, he wanted their wedding day to be absolutely perfect. He had chosen the beautiful St. Michael's Cathedral in downtown Columbus, with its towering stained glass windows and mahogany pews that could seat 200 guests comfortably. The flowers were white roses and baby's breath, Sarah's favorite combination, arranged by the most expensive florist in the city. The reception would be held at the historic Franklin Park Conservatory, complete with a 12-piece orchestra and a dinner menu that had taken them months to finalize. Marcus stood in the small preparation room behind the altar, adjusting his black tuxedo for the 100th time that morning. His hands were shaking slightly, not from nervousness about marrying Sarah, but from the overwhelming responsibility of making sure everything went according to plan. He had been awake since 5 in the morning, double-checking every detail with the wedding coordinator, making sure the flowers had arrived on time, confirming that the photographer was in position, and ensuring that the ring bearer, his 6-year-old nephew Tommy, actually had both rings securely attached to the pillow. Danny Rodriguez, his best man and friend since 4th grade, lounged in a chair nearby, seemingly completely relaxed despite the magnitude of the day. Danny was everything Marcus wasn't. Spontaneous where Marcus was planned, carefree where Marcus was careful, and absolutely terrible at taking anything seriously when the situation called for gravity. They had been an unlikely pair since childhood. Marcus, the responsible student who always did his homework and never missed curfew, and Danny, the class clown who somehow managed to pass every test despite never studying and who could make anyone laugh even in detention. Their friendship had survived high school, college at different universities, and even Marcus's accounting career and Danny's decision to become a freelance comedian and part-time construction worker. Danny had been there for every major moment in Marcus's life. His first date disaster in sophomore year, his college graduation when his parents couldn't attend because of his father's work schedule, his job interview for his current position at Henderson Associates, and the night he had decided to propose to Sarah. In fact, Danny had been the one to talk Marcus out of proposing at a fancy restaurant, and instead encouraged him to propose during their weekly hiking trip to Hocking Hills, which had turned out to be infinitely more meaningful and personal. Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell was everything Marcus had ever dreamed of in a partner. They had met during their junior year at Ohio State University in an incredibly unromantic way. She had accidentally spilled coffee on his laptop in the library during finals week, destroying 3 hours of work on his advanced taxation project. Instead of getting angry, Marcus had laughed and said that he probably needed a break anyway. Sarah had insisted on buying him a new coffee and staying up all night to help him recreate his lost work. By sunrise, they were not only finished with the project, but had discovered they both loved terrible reality TV shows, had the same favorite pizza topping combination, pepperoni and mushroom, and shared a dream of eventually traveling to New Zealand. Their relationship had progressed naturally and comfortably over the following 2 years. Sarah was pursuing her master's degree in elementary education and working part-time at a local elementary school. She was patient, kind, incredibly organized, and possessed the rare ability to find humor in Marcus's sometimes excessive need to plan every aspect of their lives. She tolerated his detailed spreadsheets for their vacation itineraries, his color-coded calendar system, and his tendency to research restaurants for 3 hours before making dinner reservations. In return, Marcus supported her dream of eventually opening her own tutoring center for children with learning disabilities and never complained about the constant presence of glitter and construction paper in their apartment from her various classroom projects. The engagement had been everything both families had hoped for. Marcus's parents, Robert and Linda Thompson, had welcomed Sarah as the daughter they had never had. Robert, a retired postal worker, appreciated Sarah's down-to-earth nature and her genuine interest in his extensive stamp collection. Linda, who worked as a nurse at Columbus General Hospital, admired Sarah's dedication to education and her patience with children. Sarah's parents, Dr. James Mitchell, a dentist, and Patricia Mitchell, who managed her husband's dental practice, had initially been slightly concerned about Marcus's quiet nature and detailed planning, but had quickly grown to appreciate his reliability and his obvious devotion to their daughter. The wedding preparations had taken over their lives for the past 8 months. Sarah had dreamed of a traditional church wedding since childhood, and Marcus wanted to give her everything she had ever imagined. They had attended countless venue tours, cake tastings, flower consultations, and music auditions. Sarah's 3 bridesmaids, her college roommates Jennifer, Michelle, and Amanda, had been incredibly helpful and supportive throughout the planning process. They had organized a bachelorette party weekend in Nashville that Sarah still talked about with a huge smile, and they had been present for every dress fitting and vendor meeting. Marcus had chosen Danny as his best man without hesitation, despite Sarah's gentle suggestion that perhaps his more serious cousin, David, might be a better choice for such an important role. Marcus's other groomsmen were his college roommate Kevin, who now worked as a software engineer in Cincinnati, and his younger brother Tyler, who was finishing his final year at Ohio State studying mechanical engineering. Danny had taken his role seriously in his own unique way. He had organized a bachelor party weekend camping trip to Lake Erie that had been exactly what Marcus wanted: relaxed and fun without any of the typical bachelor party chaos that might have caused problems with Sarah. The morning of the wedding had started perfectly. The weather was exactly what they had hoped for: sunny and 75 degrees with a light breeze that would keep the outdoor photography session comfortable. All the vendors had arrived on schedule. The decorations were exactly as Sarah had envisioned them, and the early arriving guests were commenting on how beautiful everything looked. Sarah's dress, a stunning ivory gown with intricate lace detailing that her grandmother had helped her choose, fit perfectly after the final alterations. Her hair and makeup, done by professionals she had carefully researched and booked 9 months in advance, looked flawless in all the preliminary photos. Marcus had eaten a light breakfast despite his nervous stomach, reviewed his vows one final time, and confirmed with Danny that the rings were secure and that his speech for the reception was prepared. Everything was proceeding exactly according to their detailed timeline, which Marcus had created and shared with every member of the wedding party and all the vendors 6 weeks prior to the wedding date. The guests began arriving at 11:30 for the noon ceremony, and Marcus watched through the small window in the preparation room as familiar faces filled the pews. His co-workers from Henderson and Associates occupied 2 rows on the right side, along with several clients who had become friends over the years. Sarah's elementary school colleagues and former professors filled several rows on the left side, along with neighbors from her childhood neighborhood and family friends who had watched her grow up. His grandparents, who had driven up from southern Ohio specifically for the wedding, were seated in the front row alongside Sarah's grandparents, who had flown in from Arizona the day before. Uncle Michael, his father's brother who had served as a father figure during Marcus's teenage years when his parents had gone through a difficult financial period, was there with his wife Carol and their 3 children. Sarah's extensive family, including cousins from Pennsylvania, Michigan, and even one aunt from California, filled several additional rows. Danny stood up and walked to the window, peering out at the assembled guests. "Man, Sarah really does have a huge family," he observed, straightening his tie. "I count at least 40 people on her side that I've never seen before." 53. Marcus corrected automatically. "We sent out 212 invitations total, and we received confirmations for 187 guests. Sarah's extended family accounts for 53 of those attendees." Danny shook his head with a grin. "Only you would have the exact numbers memorized. Do you also know how many people ordered the chicken versus the beef for dinner?" "Actually, yes," Marcus replied seriously. 112 people chose the chicken, 62 chose the beef, and 13 chose the vegetarian option." "Of course you do," Danny laughed, but not in a mocking way. He had long ago accepted and even admired Marcus's incredible attention to detail. "That's exactly why Sarah is perfect for you. She appreciates that you actually remember these things instead of thinking you're completely crazy." Marcus smiled, thinking about Sarah and how she had not only tolerated but actually encouraged his organizational tendencies. She had even helped him create some of the planning spreadsheets, adding her own color-coding system for different vendor categories. She understood that his need to plan every detail came from his desire to make sure everything was perfect for the people he loved, not from an inability to be spontaneous or flexible. The wedding coordinator, a professional woman named Mrs. Patterson who had been recommended by 3 different couples, knocked on the door and entered with her clipboard and wireless headset. "Gentlemen, we're at 15 minutes until processional. The bride is ready, the families are seated, and the musicians are in position. Marcus, how are you feeling?" "Ready," Marcus replied, though his voice came out slightly higher than normal. "Everything is on schedule. Everything is perfect," Mrs. Patterson assured him with the calm confidence that had made her one of the most sought-after wedding coordinators in Columbus. "Sarah looks absolutely beautiful. The flowers are gorgeous, and I haven't heard a single complaint or concern from any of the guests. This is going to be a wonderful ceremony." Danny clapped Marcus on the shoulder. "You hear that? Everything is perfect. Sarah is beautiful," which we already knew, "and all these people are here because they love you too and want to celebrate with you. All you have to do is walk out there, say I do when the pastor asks, and then party with your wife for the rest of the night." Marcus nodded, taking a deep breath and feeling his nervousness begin to transform into excitement. This was really happening. After 2 years of engagement and 8 months of planning, he was about to marry the woman he loved in front of everyone who mattered to them. The ceremony would be beautiful, the reception would be fun, and then they would leave for their honeymoon in Ireland, a trip they had been planning almost as long as the wedding itself. 5 minutes, gentlemen," Mrs. Patterson announced. "It's time to take your positions." Marcus and Danny followed her out of the preparation room and walked through a side door that led directly to the altar area. The church was even more beautiful than Marcus had imagined, with sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows and casting colorful patterns across the walls and floor. The white roses and baby's breath looked elegant and classic, exactly as Sarah had envisioned them. The guests were seated and talking quietly among themselves, creating a warm, anticipatory atmosphere. Pastor Williams, who had counseled Marcus and Sarah through their pre-marriage sessions and had gotten to know them well over the past several months, greeted them warmly and took his position at the center of the altar. Marcus and Danny stood to his right, with Marcus facing the center aisle where Sarah would soon appear. The musicians, a string quartet that specialized in wedding ceremonies, began playing the processional music. First came the bridesmaids, Jennifer in a soft blue dress, carrying a bouquet of white roses, followed by Michelle, and then Amanda, each looking elegant and happy. Next came the ring bearer, little Tommy, who walked slowly and carefully down the aisle, concentrating intensely on not dropping the pillow with the rings. Finally, the music changed to the traditional wedding march, and every guest stood and turned toward the back of the church. Marcus's breath caught in his throat as Sarah appeared at the end of the aisle with her father. She looked absolutely radiant in her ivory gown, her dark hair styled in an elegant updo with small white flowers woven throughout, and her face glowing with happiness behind her grandmother's pearl-trimmed veil. Dr. Mitchell, looking proud and emotional, walked slowly beside his daughter, savoring these final moments before officially giving her away. As they made their way down the aisle, Sarah's eyes found Marcus's, and she smiled the same brilliant smile that had captured his attention in the university library 3 years earlier. Marcus felt all his nervousness disappear, replaced by overwhelming love and gratitude that this incredible woman had chosen to spend her life with him. Everything was perfect, absolutely perfect. Nothing could possibly go wrong. Sarah reached the altar looking like she had stepped out of a fairy tale, and Dr. Mitchell placed her hand in Marcus's with a warm smile and a whispered "take care of her" before taking a seat in the front row next to his wife, who was already dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. Marcus squeezed Sarah's hand gently, and she squeezed back, both of them sharing a moment of pure happiness and anticipation. Pastor Williams smiled warmly at the couple and began the ceremony with a welcome to all the gathered family and friends. His voice carried clearly throughout the church as he spoke about the significance of marriage, the importance of community support, and the joy of witnessing two people commit their lives to each other. Marcus had specifically chosen Pastor Williams because of his reputation for conducting meaningful, personal ceremonies that felt genuine rather than formal and impersonal. "We are gathered here today," Pastor Williams continued, "to celebrate the union of Marcus Robert Thompson and Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell in holy matrimony. Marriage is a sacred covenant, not to be entered into lightly, but with reverence, commitment, and joy." Marcus felt completely focused and present in the moment. Sarah looked beautiful standing beside him, and he could see their families and friends smiling and watching with obvious happiness and support. His parents were sitting in the second row, his father looking unusually formal in his best suit, and his mother wearing the navy blue dress she had purchased specifically for the wedding. Sarah's bridesmaids were arranged to his left, each holding their bouquets and watching the ceremony with genuine emotion. Danny stood slightly behind Marcus, and to his right, holding the ring box and maintaining the serious demeanor that Marcus had specifically requested for the ceremony itself. They had discussed this multiple times during the bachelor party weekend. Danny could be his usual funny self during the reception, but Marcus had asked him to keep things respectful and traditional during the actual ceremony. Danny had agreed without any argument, understanding how important this moment was to his best friend. The pastor led them through the traditional opening prayers and readings, including Sarah's favorite passage from 1 Corinthians about love being patient and kind, which her grandmother had read at her own wedding 47 years earlier. Sarah's voice was clear and confident as she participated in the responsive readings, and Marcus felt proud of how composed and radiant she appeared despite what he knew must be considerable nervousness. "Marcus and Sarah have chosen to write their own vows," Pastor Williams announced, expressing in their own words the promises they wish to make to each other today. This had been Sarah's idea, and initially Marcus had been terrified at the prospect of speaking his personal feelings in front of 187 guests. However, Sarah had helped him work through his nervousness, and they'd spent several evenings together crafting vows that were meaningful, but not overly emotional or lengthy. Marcus had his vows memorized completely, having practiced them dozens of times in front of the bathroom mirror over the past month. Sarah went first, pulling a small piece of paper from her bouquet and unfolding it carefully. Her voice was steady and filled with emotion as she spoke about how Marcus had shown her what it meant to be truly supported and cherished. She talked about his kindness, his reliability, and his ability to make her feel safe and loved even during difficult times. She mentioned specific memories, how he had stayed up all night with her when she was sick with the flu during their second year together, how he had driven 6 hours to surprise her when she was struggling with student teaching, and how he had supported her dream of working with special needs children even though it would mean a lower starting salary than other teaching positions. Marcus, you have shown me that love is not just a feeling, but a daily choice to put someone else's happiness alongside your own, Sarah concluded, her voice slightly shaky with emotion. I promise to love you through all of life's adventures, to support your dreams as you have supported mine, and to choose you every single day for the rest of our lives together. Marcus felt his eyes well up with tears as Sarah finished her vows. Several people in the congregation were also visibly emotional, including Sarah's mother, who was crying openly, and his own mother, who was smiling through her tears. Even Danny, who Marcus could see from his peripheral vision, seemed genuinely moved by Sarah's heartfelt words. Now it was Marcus's turn. He had decided against using notes, wanting to speak directly to Sarah from his heart while maintaining the professionalism and composure that felt appropriate for the setting. He took Sarah's free hand in both of his and looked directly into her eyes, speaking clearly enough for everyone to hear, but focusing entirely on her. Sarah, 3 years ago, you literally crashed into my life when you spilled coffee on my laptop, Marcus began, earning quiet chuckles from guests who knew the story. But what I discovered that night as we worked together until sunrise was not just that you made terrible coffee, but that you were everything I had been hoping to find in a partner without even knowing it. He continued, talking about how she had taught him that it was okay to be spontaneous sometimes, how she had brought more laughter and joy into his carefully planned life, and how she had shown him that two people could be completely different in many ways, but still complement each other perfectly. He spoke about his promise to support her career goals, to try new things even when they scared him, and to always make time for the little things that made her happy, like Sunday morning pancakes and terrible reality TV marathons. I promise to love you not just on the easy days when everything goes according to plan, Marcus said, but especially on the difficult days when nothing goes right and we have to figure things out together. I choose you today, and I will choose you every day for the rest of our lives. Sarah was crying by the time he finished, and she mouthed, I love you, while wiping carefully at her eyes to avoid ruining her makeup. The congregation was clearly moved, and Marcus felt a sense of accomplishment and relief that he had managed to express his feelings clearly and meaningfully without becoming too emotional to continue. Pastor Williams smiled warmly at both of them before continuing with the traditional portion of the ceremony. Now we come to the exchange of rings, symbols of the unending love and commitment you're making to each other today. Danny, may I have the rings, please? This was the moment Marcus had been slightly nervous about, not because of anything Danny might do, but because little Tommy had been responsible for carrying the rings down the aisle, and 6-year-old children were not always the most reliable when it came to keeping track of small, important objects. However, Danny stepped forward smoothly and opened the ring box, revealing both rings exactly where they were supposed to be. Marcus, Pastor Williams continued, please take Sarah's ring and repeat after me. Marcus carefully took the platinum band they had chosen together after visiting 4 different jewelry stores and spending weeks researching options online. Sarah extended her left hand, and Marcus held the ring at the tip of her ring finger, ready to slide it into place as he recited the traditional vows. With this ring, I thee wed, Marcus said clearly, beginning to slide the ring on Sarah's finger, and with all my worldly goods I thee endow. The ring slid into place perfectly, fitting exactly as it had during the sizing appointment 6 weeks earlier. Sarah admired it briefly, smiling at how it looked next to her engagement ring, before turning her attention back to Pastor Williams for her turn. Sarah, the pastor said, please take Marcus's ring and repeat after me." Sarah picked up the matching platinum band they had chosen for Marcus, a simple, classic design that would be appropriate for his professional environment, but meaningful enough to represent their commitment. Marcus extended his left hand, and Sarah positioned the ring carefully. "With this ring, I thee wed," Sarah repeated, her voice steady and confident, "and with all my worldly goods I thee endow." Marcus's ring also fit perfectly, and he looked down at his hand for a moment, amazed by how different it felt to be wearing a wedding ring. After today, this ring would be a constant reminder of this moment and this commitment, something he would wear every single day for the rest of his life. Pastor Williams raised his voice slightly to address the entire congregation. "Marcus and Sarah have expressed their love for each other through the vows they have written and spoken, and they have sealed their commitment with the exchange of rings. Now, before this community of family and friends, I ask you to declare your intention to live as husband and wife." This was it. This was the moment Marcus had been anticipating for months. Everything had gone perfectly so far. Sarah looked beautiful. The ceremony was proceeding exactly as they had planned. Their vows had been meaningful and well received, and the rings had been exchanged without any problems. In just a few more minutes, they would be officially married, and they could begin the celebration with their family and friends. Marcus Robert Thompson, Pastor Williams said, looking directly at him, "Do you take Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish until death do you part?" Marcus opened his mouth to respond with the "I do" he had been practicing and anticipating. This was the most important moment of the entire ceremony, the moment when he would officially commit his life to Sarah in front of God and everyone they loved. But before he could speak, Danny leaned forward slightly and whispered something in his ear that only Marcus could hear. It was barely audible to anyone else in the church, just a few quiet words that Danny probably intended as a moment of support or encouragement before the big moment. What Danny whispered was, "Remember junior year when you got food poisoning from that gas station sushi and threw up on Jennifer Morrison during the homecoming dance?" The memory hit Marcus like a freight train. He had successfully buried that particular embarrassment for over 10 years, but Danny's whispered reminder brought back every mortifying detail in vivid, horrible clarity. It had been the worst night of his teenage life. He had finally worked up the courage to ask Jennifer Morrison, the girl he had been crushing on since sophomore year, to homecoming. She had said yes, and he had been so nervous and excited that he had barely eaten anything all day before the dance. On the way to pick up Jennifer, he had stopped at a gas station for breath mints and had impulsively bought a container of sushi from their prepared food section, thinking it would be a light snack that wouldn't make him feel too full during the dance. The sushi had been sitting under heat lamps for who knows how long, and within an hour of eating it, Marcus had begun feeling queasy. He had tried to power through the discomfort, not wanting to ruin the evening he had been looking forward to for weeks. Jennifer had looked beautiful in her blue dress, and they had been having a wonderful time dancing and talking with their friends. But halfway through a slow song, the food poisoning had hit him with full force, and he had vomited all over Jennifer's dress, her shoes, and part of the gymnasium floor in front of approximately 200 of their classmates. The memory was so mortifying that Marcus had never told anyone except Danny about the gas station sushi. Everyone else, including Jennifer, assumed he had just gotten sick, but Danny had been with him when he bought the questionable food and had witnessed the entire humiliating aftermath. Jennifer had been surprisingly understanding and kind about the whole incident, but Marcus had been so embarrassed that he had never asked anyone to a dance again for the rest of high school. Now, standing at the altar on his wedding day, with Pastor Williams waiting for his response and 187 guests watching expectantly, Marcus's brain chose this moment to replay every single detail of that nightmare evening. Danny's whispered reminder had triggered a completely involuntary mental slideshow of images. The gas station sushi under the heat lamps, Jennifer's horrified expression, the sound of 200 teenagers gasping in shock, the janitor's annoyed face as he brought out the mop, and his own desperate attempts to apologize while his stomach continued to betray him. The worst part was that now, with his adult perspective and years of experience with Danny's sense of humor, Marcus suddenly realized how absolutely ridiculous the entire situation had been. At 17, it had felt like the end of the world, but at 28, he could see it for what it really was: a perfectly normal teenager making a spectacularly bad food choice and suffering predictable consequences in the most public way possible. The realization of how funny it actually was, combined with the stress and emotion of his wedding day, the relief that everything had gone perfectly so far, and the sudden contrast between this beautiful, meaningful moment and his most embarrassing teenage memory, triggered something in Marcus's brain that he had no control over whatsoever. He started laughing. It began as a small snicker that he tried desperately to suppress, but the harder he tried to stop it, the funnier the whole situation became. Here he was, standing at the altar in a beautiful church, about to marry the woman of his dreams, and his best man had just reminded him of the time he threw up on his high school crush because of gas station sushi. The laughter built quickly, starting as a quiet chuckle, but growing stronger and more uncontrollable by the second. Marcus tried to cover his mouth with his hand, tried to turn it into a cough, tried to think about something serious and solemn, but nothing worked. The laughter had taken on a life of its own. Pastor Williams paused, looking slightly confused, but patient, clearly assuming that Marcus was experiencing some kind of nervous reaction that would pass in a moment. Sarah looked concerned and reached out to touch his arm, whispering, "Are you okay?" which somehow made everything even funnier because she had no idea what was happening in his head. Marcus nodded frantically, still laughing, trying to communicate that he was fine, while simultaneously being completely unable to stop the laughter that was now shaking his entire body. Tears were streaming down his face, partly from the laughter and partly from his desperate attempts to control himself. But the harder he tried to stop, the more ridiculous the whole situation became. The congregation was beginning to murmur among themselves, clearly confused about what was happening at the altar. Marcus could see his parents looking worried, Sarah's parents looking concerned, and various guests beginning to shift uncomfortably in their pews. This was definitely not part of the traditional wedding ceremony they had been expecting. Danny, realizing that his whispered reminder had triggered this completely unexpected reaction, was now torn between feeling guilty about potentially ruining his best friend's wedding and finding the whole situation absolutely hilarious himself. He tried to maintain his serious best man demeanor, but Marcus could see him struggling not to laugh as well. Pastor Williams cleared his throat gently and tried again. "Marcus, do you take Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Marcus took a deep breath, wiped his eyes, and tried to compose himself enough to respond properly. This was his wedding day. This was the most important moment of his life. Sarah was standing beside him, looking beautiful and concerned, and nearly 200 people were waiting for him to say two simple words so they could continue with the ceremony and the celebration. All he had to do was say, "I do." 2 words. That was it. But as he opened his mouth to respond, his brain helpfully supplied him with another vivid memory: the sound Jennifer Morrison had made when she looked down and realized what had happened to her dress. It had been a small, shocked "oh," followed by a moment of complete silence as she processed what had just occurred. Marcus completely lost it again. The second wave of laughter was even worse than the first. Marcus was now doubled over, gasping for breath between fits of uncontrollable giggling, tears streaming down his face, his whole body shaking with the force of his hysteria. The beautiful, solemn atmosphere of the church ceremony had completely evaporated, replaced by a growing sense of confusion and concern among the guests. Sarah's expression had shifted from concerned to alarmed to something approaching panic. This was her wedding day, the day she had been planning and dreaming about for months, and her groom was having some kind of breakdown at the altar in front of everyone they knew. She had no idea what Danny had whispered to Marcus, no context for understanding why her usually composed and reliable fiancé was suddenly behaving like he had lost his mind during the most important moment of their lives together. "Marcus, honey, what's wrong?" Sarah whispered urgently, trying to maintain her composure while also attempting to figure out how to handle this unprecedented situation. She had known Marcus for 3 years, and she had never seen him lose control like this. Even during stressful situations like final exams or job interviews, Marcus had always been calm, logical, and measured in his responses. Pastor Williams, who had performed hundreds of wedding ceremonies during his 20-year career, had never encountered anything quite like this. He had dealt with nervous grooms, crying brides, fainting groomsmen, and even the occasional objection from the congregation, but he had never had a groom completely break down laughing during the vows. His pastoral training had prepared him for many challenging situations, but not this particular scenario. The pastor tried again, speaking more firmly this time, hoping that a more authoritative tone might help Marcus regain his composure. "Son, I need you to take a deep breath and answer the question. Do you take Sarah to be your wife?" Marcus attempted to straighten up and respond, but every time he tried to speak, the memory of that terrible homecoming night would resurface, triggering fresh waves of laughter. He was caught in a horrible cycle. The more he laughed, the more inappropriate and ridiculous his behavior seemed, which made him laugh even harder at the absurdity of the entire situation. The congregation was becoming increasingly uncomfortable. What had begun as confused murmuring was now turning into actual conversations as people tried to figure out what was happening and whether they should be concerned for Marcus's well-being. Some guests were beginning to stand up, craning their necks to get a better view of the altar and trying to determine if this was some kind of medical emergency. Marcus's mother, Linda, had gone from looking proud and emotional to genuinely worried about her son's mental state. She leaned over to her husband, Robert, and whispered, "Should we do something? Is he having some kind of panic attack?" Robert, who had known Marcus his entire life and had never seen him behave erratically, shook his head uncertainly. "I don't know. Maybe we should wait and see if he can pull himself together." Sarah's parents were having a similar whispered conversation in their front row seats. Dr. Mitchell was beginning to wonder if perhaps Marcus had some kind of underlying anxiety condition that Sarah had never mentioned, while Patricia was calculating how many people would need to be called if they had to postpone or cancel the ceremony. The bridesmaids, standing to the left of Sarah in their coordinated blue dresses, were exchanging worried glances and trying to figure out if they should step forward to help or stay in their designated positions. Jennifer, who had known Sarah since college, was particularly concerned because she had never heard Sarah mention anything about Marcus having anxiety issues or panic attacks. Danny was now facing a terrible dilemma. He realized that his innocent attempt to ease Marcus's pre-ceremony nerves by reminding him of a shared funny memory had somehow triggered this catastrophic reaction. He was torn between feeling responsible for potentially ruining his best friend's wedding and finding the whole situation genuinely hilarious, especially since he knew exactly why Marcus was laughing and could appreciate the absurdity of the timing. Part of Danny wanted to step forward and explain to everyone what had happened, but he also recognized that telling a church full of people that the groom was laughing because he had just been reminded of the time he threw up on his high school date might not actually improve the situation. He decided to try a different approach and leaned toward Marcus again, this time attempting to help rather than unintentionally sabotage. "Dude," Danny whispered as quietly as possible, "you need to get it together. Sarah is freaking out, and everyone thinks you're having some kind of breakdown. Think about something serious. Think about your taxes. Think about work. Think about anything except homecoming." Unfortunately, Danny's mention of homecoming triggered yet another vivid memory from Marcus. The ride home that night, sitting in his father's car with his ruined tuxedo, listening to his dad try to convince him that everyone would forget about it by Monday morning. His father had been wrong, of course. People had talked about it for weeks, and Marcus had earned the unfortunate nickname Sushi that had followed him for the rest of high school. The memory of his father's well-intentioned but completely inaccurate prediction struck Marcus as so absurdly funny that he let out a loud snort of laughter that echoed throughout the church. Several guests gasped, and one elderly woman in the back actually said, "Oh my," loud enough for half the congregation to hear. Pastor Williams decided that he needed to take control of the situation before it deteriorated further. He had a reputation for conducting dignified, meaningful ceremonies, and he could not allow this wedding to become a complete circus, regardless of what was causing the groom's unusual behavior. "Ladies and gentlemen," Pastor Williams announced to the congregation, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to managing difficult situations. "We are going to take a brief recess to allow the wedding party to collect themselves. Please remain seated, and we will resume the ceremony in a few minutes." This announcement caused a ripple of concerned conversation throughout the church. Many guests began speculating about what could possibly be wrong. Some wondered if Marcus was having second thoughts about the marriage. Others worried that he might be experiencing some kind of medical emergency. A few people began quietly discussing whether they should leave and come back later, or if they should stay and wait to see what happened next. Sarah's face had gone pale beneath her carefully applied makeup. The reality of the situation was beginning to sink in. Her wedding ceremony had been interrupted. Her groom was acting completely out of character, and nearly 200 people were watching and forming opinions about what was happening. This was supposed to be the most beautiful day of her life, and instead it was turning into a public humiliation. Mrs. Patterson, the wedding coordinator, quickly stepped into action. She had dealt with various wedding emergencies during her career, and while she had never encountered this exact situation, she knew that the most important thing was to maintain control and try to salvage the ceremony if possible. She approached the altar and spoke quietly to Pastor Williams, Sarah, and the groomsmen. "Let's move everyone to the preparation room," she suggested efficiently. "We can give Marcus a few minutes to compose himself, figure out what's happening, and decide how to proceed." Sarah nodded gratefully, relieved that someone was taking charge and offering a solution. She was fighting back tears of embarrassment and frustration, but she was also genuinely concerned about Marcus. In 3 years together, she had never seen him behave this way, and she was beginning to worry that something might be seriously wrong. Danny immediately stepped forward to help guide Marcus toward the preparation room. Marcus was still laughing intermittently, though the intensity had decreased slightly. He seemed aware that something was wrong and that people were concerned, but he appeared unable to stop the inappropriate laughter that was continuing to bubble up at random intervals. "Come on, buddy," Danny said, taking Marcus's arm and steering him away from the altar. "Let's go sit down for a minute." The groomsmen, Kevin and Tyler, followed behind them, both looking confused and concerned. They had known Marcus for years, and neither of them had ever seen him lose control like this. Tyler, Marcus's younger brother, was particularly worried because he knew how important this wedding was to Marcus and how much time and effort he had put into making sure everything went perfectly. Sarah walked beside them, her wedding dress rustling softly as she moved, her bouquet clutched tightly in her hands. She was trying to maintain her composure and dignity in front of their guests, but inside she was struggling with a mixture of embarrassment, worry, and growing frustration. This was supposed to be their perfect day, and somehow it was turning into a disaster. The bridesmaids followed the group toward the preparation room, unsure of what their role should be in this unprecedented situation. They wanted to support Sarah, but they also didn't want to crowd the small room or interfere with whatever conversation needed to happen to resolve the crisis. As the wedding party disappeared through the side door, the congregation was left sitting in confused silence. Many people were checking their phones, texting family members who weren't at the wedding about the strange turn of events. Others were quietly discussing possible explanations for what they had just witnessed. The beautiful, solemn atmosphere that had characterized the beginning of the ceremony had been completely replaced by an uncomfortable tension and uncertainty about what would happen next. Marcus's grandparents, who had driven several hours to attend the wedding, were particularly confused and concerned. They whispered to each other about whether they should go check on their grandson or wait for someone to come out and explain what was happening. Sarah's extended family, many of whom had traveled significant distances to attend the wedding, were beginning to wonder if they should make alternative plans for the day. The reception was supposed to begin immediately after the ceremony, and it was unclear whether there would still be a celebration to attend. In the preparation room, Marcus finally began to calm down as he sat in a chair and focused on taking deep breaths. The separation from the formal ceremony setting and the expectant congregation helped him begin to regain control of his emotional response. Danny sat beside him, feeling guilty and concerned about his role in creating this crisis. Sarah stood in front of Marcus, her beautiful wedding dress spread around her, her carefully styled hair still perfect despite everything that had just happened. She looked down at her groom, the man she loved and had chosen to spend her life with, and tried to figure out how to address what had just occurred. "Marcus," she said quietly, her voice steady but clearly emotional, "I need you to tell me what just happened out there. I need to understand why you started laughing during our wedding vows, because right now I have no idea what to think or how to feel about this." Marcus looked up at her, seeing the confusion and hurt in her eyes, and finally managed to speak clearly for the first time since the ceremony had begun to go wrong. "Sarah, I am so sorry," he said, his voice shaky with emotion. "I love you more than anything in the world, and I want nothing more than to marry you today. What just happened had nothing to do with you or our wedding or my feelings about getting married." Sarah sat down across from him, her dress billowing around her chair. "Then what was it about? Because from where I was standing, it looked like you found the idea of marrying me hilarious. And I have to tell you, that was probably the most humiliating experience of my life." Danny cleared his throat uncomfortably, realizing that he needed to take responsibility for his role in this disaster. "Sarah, this is my fault. I whispered something to Marcus right before he was supposed to answer, and it triggered a memory that made him laugh at the worst possible time." Sarah turned to look at Danny, her expression shifting from hurt to confused to angry. "You whispered something to him during our wedding vows? What could you possibly have said that would cause this kind of reaction?" Danny and Marcus exchanged a look, both realizing that they were going to have to explain the entire embarrassing homecoming story to Sarah in order to help her understand what had happened. It was not a conversation either of them had ever planned to have, especially not on Marcus's wedding day, while wearing tuxedos in a church preparation room with nearly 200 guests waiting outside. Marcus took a deep breath and looked directly at Sarah, realizing that he was going to have to tell her about the most embarrassing moment of his teenage life if he had any hope of salvaging their wedding day. The irony was not lost on him that in order to marry the woman he loved, he was going to have to share a story he had successfully hidden from her for their entire 3-year relationship. "Okay," Marcus began, his voice still slightly unsteady. "I need to tell you about something that happened to me in high school that I've never told you about, because it's probably the most embarrassing thing that ever happened to me in my entire life." Sarah folded her hands in her lap, her wedding ring catching the light from the small window in the preparation room. She was still clearly upset and confused, but she was also curious about what could possibly have triggered such an extreme reaction from the man she thought she knew better than anyone. "During my junior year," Marcus continued, "I finally got up the courage to ask Jennifer Morrison to homecoming. She was this girl I had been crushing on since sophomore year, and I was convinced she was completely out of my league. When she actually said yes, I was so excited and nervous that I could barely function for the entire week leading up to the dance." Danny nodded, remembering how nervous Marcus had been. "He practiced asking her for like 2 weeks," Danny added, trying to be supportive. "He had the whole thing planned out, including backup conversation topics in case he ran out of things to say. Sarah's expression softened slightly as she pictured a 17-year-old Marcus nervously preparing for his first real date. Even in her current state of confusion and frustration, she could appreciate how sweet and earnest he must have been. So the night of the dance, Marcus continued, I was so nervous that I couldn't eat dinner. My stomach was in knots, and I didn't want to feel too full while we were dancing. On the way to pick up Jennifer, I stopped at this gas station to buy breath mints, and I saw they had this container of sushi in their prepared food section. Sarah's eyes widened slightly as she began to anticipate where this story might be heading. She had never heard this tale before, but she was starting to understand why it might be particularly mortifying. I thought it would be perfect, Marcus explained, shaking his head at his teenage logic. Light, not too filling, wouldn't make me feel bloated during the dance. What I didn't consider was that gas station sushi that had been sitting under heat lamps for who knows how long might not be the best dietary choice before a major social event. Danny was trying not to smile as Marcus told the story, remembering how confident Marcus had been about his food choice at the time. I tried to talk him out of it. Danny interjected. I told him gas station sushi seemed like a risky move, but he was convinced it was genius. Within an hour of eating it, I started feeling queasy, Marcus continued. But I didn't want to ruin the evening that I'd been looking forward to for weeks. Jennifer looked beautiful. We were having a great time, and I thought I could just power through whatever stomach discomfort I was experiencing. Sarah was beginning to piece together the story, and despite her lingering frustration about their disrupted ceremony, she was also starting to feel sympathy for the teenage version of her fiancé who had been trying so hard to impress his date. We were having a wonderful time, Marcus said, his voice growing more emotional as he remembered the evening. We were dancing, talking with our friends, and I was thinking that this might be the perfect night I had been hoping for. And then, halfway through a slow song, the food poisoning hit me with full force. Marcus paused, clearly struggling with the memory of what came next. Sarah waited patiently, beginning to understand why this particular story had triggered such an extreme reaction during their wedding ceremony. I threw up all over Jennifer, Marcus said quietly. Her dress, her shoes, part of the gymnasium floor, in front of about 200 of our classmates. It was the most mortifying moment of my entire life, and I never told anyone except Danny about the gas station sushi because I was so embarrassed about making such a stupid decision. Sarah stared at Marcus for a moment, processing this information. She was trying to imagine her usually careful, thoughtful fiancé as a nervous teenager making disastrous food choices and suffering the consequences in the most public way possible. Oh my God, Sarah said softly, her anger beginning to transform into sympathy and understanding. That must have been absolutely horrible for you. It was, Marcus confirmed. I was so humiliated that I never asked anyone to a dance again for the rest of high school. I convinced myself that I was cursed when it came to romantic situations, and it took me years to build up the confidence to even consider dating seriously. Danny nodded, remembering how the incident had affected Marcus's self-esteem throughout the rest of high school. He was convinced that every girl in school knew the story and thought he was a complete disaster, Danny explained. It took until college for him to really get past it. Sarah was beginning to understand the full picture now. She could see how the memory of such a traumatic and embarrassing experience, triggered at the worst possible moment during their wedding ceremony, might cause an involuntary and uncontrollable reaction. So, when Danny whispered about it during the ceremony, Sarah said slowly, it brought back all those memories and made you realize how funny the situation actually was in hindsight? Exactly, Marcus said, relief evident in his voice that Sarah was beginning to understand. At 17, it felt like the end of the world. But standing there today, as an adult, about to marry you, suddenly, I could see it for what it really was, a ridiculous situation caused by terrible decision-making and bad luck. And the contrast between that awful night and this beautiful day just struck me as so absurd that I couldn't stop laughing. Sarah was quiet for a moment, considering everything she had just learned. She was still processing the fact that her wedding ceremony had been derailed by a story from Marcus's teenage years. But she was also beginning to appreciate the irony of the situation. "I can understand why that would be funny," Sarah said slowly, "but I have to admit that from my perspective, watching my groom laugh hysterically during our wedding vows without any context was pretty terrifying." Marcus reached out and took Sarah's hands in his own. "I know, and I am so incredibly sorry that it happened this way. The last thing I ever wanted was to embarrass you or ruin our wedding day. You have to believe that my reaction had absolutely nothing to do with you or my feelings about marrying you." "I believe you," Sarah said, squeezing his hands. "But we still have a church full of people out there waiting to find out what happened and whether we're actually going to get married today." Mrs. Patterson, who had been quietly observing the conversation from the corner of the room, stepped forward with her clipboard and professional demeanor intact. "If I may suggest," she said diplomatically, "we have several options for how to proceed. We can resume the ceremony exactly where we left off, we can start the ceremony over from the beginning, or we could take a longer break to allow everyone to collect themselves before continuing." Tyler, Marcus's brother, spoke up from where he had been sitting quietly with Kevin. "Whatever you guys decide, you should probably make a decision soon. People are starting to get restless out there, and some of the older relatives are asking if they should call anyone or if there's some kind of emergency." Sarah looked at Marcus, trying to gauge his emotional state and his readiness to continue with the ceremony. He appeared much calmer now that he had explained what had happened, but she wanted to make sure he was truly ready to proceed before they subjected themselves to another potentially disastrous public moment. "How are you feeling now?" Sarah asked Marcus directly. "Do you think you can get through the rest of the ceremony without any more outbursts?" Marcus nodded emphatically. "Yes, absolutely. Now that I've told you what happened and gotten it out of my system, I feel completely fine. I want nothing more than to go back out there and marry you properly this time." Danny, who had been feeling guilty about his role in creating the crisis, spoke up again. "For what it's worth, I think we should go back out there and finish what we started. Everyone is here to celebrate with you guys, and once you explain what happened, I think most people will understand and just be happy that everything is okay." Sarah considered this suggestion. The idea of facing their guests again after what had just happened was somewhat intimidating, but she also didn't want their wedding day to be remembered as the day the ceremony was canceled because of an inappropriate laughing fit. "What would we tell everyone?" Sarah asked. "We can't exactly announce to the entire congregation that you had a breakdown because Danny reminded you of the time you threw up on your high school date." Marcus and Danny exchanged a look, both realizing that they were going to need to come up with a simplified explanation that would satisfy their guests' curiosity without sharing all the embarrassing details of the homecoming story. "We could just say that I had a brief moment of nervous laughter caused by pre-wedding jitters," Marcus suggested. "We don't have to go into all the specific details about what triggered it." "That's actually not far from the truth," Sarah agreed. "And I think most people would understand that weddings can be stressful and that people sometimes react unexpectedly to pressure." Mrs. Patterson nodded approvingly. "That's a perfectly reasonable explanation, and I think your guests will be relieved to hear that everything is fine and the ceremony can continue." Jennifer, Sarah's college friend and maid of honor, knocked on the door and entered the preparation room. She had been designated by the other bridesmaids to check on the situation and find out what the plan was going forward. "How is everyone doing in here?" Jennifer asked, looking concerned, but relieved to see that Marcus appeared much calmer than he had been during his breakdown at the altar. "We're okay," Sarah replied. "Marcus had a moment of nervous laughter, but we've talked through it, and we're ready to continue with the ceremony." Jennifer smiled, clearly relieved that the wedding was going to proceed as planned. "That's wonderful. Should I let everyone know that you'll be resuming the ceremony soon?" "Yes," Sarah said, standing up and smoothing her wedding dress. "Give us about 5 minutes to collect ourselves, and then we'll come back out and finish what we started." As Jennifer left to relay the message to the waiting congregation, Marcus stood up and looked at Sarah with an expression of gratitude and love that reminded her exactly why she had fallen in love with him in the first place. "Thank you," Marcus said sincerely. "Thank you for listening, for understanding, and for not deciding that I was completely crazy and calling off the wedding." Sarah smiled, feeling the tension and stress of the past 20 minutes beginning to fade away. "Marcus, if I was going to call off our wedding, it would take a lot more than one embarrassing story from your teenage years. Although I have to admit, I'm impressed that you managed to keep that particular tale a secret for 3 whole years of dating." "Well," Marcus said with a sheepish grin, "I was planning to tell you about it eventually. Maybe on our 50th wedding anniversary or something." "Lucky me. I get to hear it on our actual wedding day instead," Sarah laughed. And for the first time since the ceremony had been interrupted, she sounded genuinely happy and relaxed. Danny stepped forward, still looking somewhat guilty about his role in the crisis. "Sarah, I want to apologize again for my terrible timing with that comment. I was just trying to lighten the mood a little bit, and I had no idea it would trigger that kind of reaction." Sarah looked at Danny thoughtfully. Despite her initial anger about his inappropriate whisper during the ceremony, she was beginning to appreciate that his intention had been supportive, even if his execution had been disastrous. "Danny, I forgive you," Sarah said, "but I'm making you promise me right now that you will not mention anything embarrassing or funny during the reception toast tonight. I want the rest of this wedding to proceed without any more surprises." Danny laughed and held up his right hand as if taking an oath. "I promise to keep my speech completely appropriate and embarrassment-free. No more stories about high school disasters or anything else that might trigger unwanted laughter at inappropriate moments." Marcus felt a wave of relief and gratitude as he looked around the room at the people who had just helped him through one of the most mortifying experiences of his adult life. Despite the chaos and confusion of the past 20 minutes, he was surrounded by people who cared about him and wanted his wedding day to be special and memorable for all the right reasons. Mrs. Patterson opened the door slightly and peered into the preparation room. "Are we ready to resume?" she asked with professional calm, as if wedding ceremonies were interrupted by hysterical laughter every day of the week. Marcus straightened his tuxedo jacket, ran his hands through his hair to make sure it was still presentable, and looked at Sarah one final time. She was radiant despite everything they had just been through, her makeup somehow still perfect, and her smile genuine and warm. "I'm ready," Marcus said with conviction. "Let's go get married." Sarah picked up her bouquet and smoothed her dress one last time. "I'm ready too." "And Marcus, after we get through the rest of this ceremony without any more incidents, I want to hear every embarrassing story from your past that you've been hiding from me. I clearly have a lot to catch up on." Marcus laughed, but this time it was a normal, happy laugh rather than the uncontrollable hysteria that had derailed their ceremony 20 minutes earlier. "Deal, but maybe we can save those conversations for after the honeymoon." The wedding party filed out of the preparation room and made their way back to the altar. As they emerged, the congregation visibly relaxed, relieved to see everyone looking calm and composed. There had been considerable speculation during their absence about what could have caused such an unusual disruption, and many guests had been genuinely worried about the couple's well-being. Pastor Williams stepped back to his position at the center of the altar and addressed the congregation with a warm smile. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience during our brief recess. As many of you know, weddings can be emotional occasions, and sometimes that emotion expresses itself in unexpected ways." Marcus experienced a moment of nervous laughter, but he and Sarah are ready to continue with their ceremony. The congregation chuckled good-naturedly at this explanation, and Marcus could see relief on the faces of his parents, Sarah's family, and their friends. Several people were smiling and nodding sympathetically, clearly remembering their own wedding day nerves or similar situations they had witnessed at other ceremonies. Marcus and Sarah took their positions at the altar once again, this time both feeling much more relaxed and prepared for what was to come. Danny stood in his designated spot, making a mental note to keep his mouth completely shut until the ceremony was officially concluded. The bridesmaids arranged themselves in their proper places, and Pastor Williams opened his prayer book to resume where they had left off. "Now then," Pastor Williams said with gentle authority, "Marcus Robert Thompson, do you take Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have, and to hold from this day forward, for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until death do you part?" Marcus looked directly into Sarah's eyes, feeling completely calm and focused for the first time since the ceremony had begun. All the nervousness, all the pressure to have everything be perfect, all the stress about making sure every detail went according to plan had been replaced by a simple, clear awareness of what this moment really meant. "I do," Marcus said clearly and confidently, his voice carrying throughout the church without any trace of the hysteria that had overwhelmed him earlier. The congregation released a collective sigh of relief, and Marcus could see his mother wiping tears of happiness from her eyes. Sarah squeezed his hands and smiled brilliantly at him, her eyes also filled with emotional tears. "Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell," Pastor Williams continued, "do you take Marcus Robert Thompson to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until death do you part?" Sarah's voice was strong and clear as she responded without hesitation. "Edo, by the power vested in me by the state of Ohio and in the sight of God," Pastor Williams announced with obvious satisfaction, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. Marcus, you may kiss your bride." Marcus and Sarah kissed for the first time as a married couple, and the congregation erupted in applause and cheers. The beautiful, solemn atmosphere that had been disrupted by Marcus's laughing fit was now replaced by genuine joy and celebration. Danny, Kevin, and Tyler were clapping enthusiastically, and the bridesmaids were crying happy tears as they watched their friend finally complete her perfect wedding ceremony. As Marcus and Sarah separated from their kiss, both of them laughing with pure happiness, Pastor Williams raised his voice to address the congregation one final time. "Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to present to you Mr. and Mrs. Marcus Thompson." The church erupted in another round of applause as the string quartet began playing the recessional music. Marcus and Sarah walked down the aisle hand in hand, both of them beaming with joy and relief that they had successfully navigated through their unexpected crisis and emerged as a married couple. Their families and friends followed them down the aisle and out of the church, where the photographer was waiting to capture formal pictures before the reception. The mood was celebratory and relaxed, with multiple people commenting on how beautiful the ceremony had been despite the brief interruption. "That was perfect," Sarah's grandmother told her as they gathered for photos outside the church. Sometimes the most memorable weddings are the ones where something unexpected happens. It just shows that you too can handle anything life throws at you. Marcus's father clapped him on the shoulder and said with a grin, "Son, if you can get through that and still manage to marry the woman of your dreams, you can probably handle whatever challenges married life has in store for you." The reception at Franklin Park Conservatory was everything Marcus and Sarah had hoped it would be. The decorations were elegant, the food was delicious, and the 12-piece orchestra provided perfect background music as their guests celebrated and danced. The earlier crisis at the church had somehow brought everyone together, creating a sense of shared experience and community that made the celebration feel even more special and meaningful. Danny's speech during dinner was, as promised, completely appropriate and heartfelt. He talked about his friendship with Marcus, his admiration for Sarah, and his confidence that they would have a wonderful marriage together. He managed to include several funny stories about Marcus without mentioning anything embarrassing or inappropriate, much to Sarah's relief and Marcus's gratitude. Marcus is the most loyal, dependable, and caring person I know, Danny concluded his speech. And Sarah, begetting a man who will plan the perfect anniversary celebration every year, remember every important date in your relationship, and probably have a spreadsheet for your Christmas gift ideas by October. The guests laughed appreciatively, and Sarah nodded enthusiastically, appreciating that Danny had found a way to lovingly tease Marcus about his organizational tendencies without crossing any inappropriate lines. As the evening progressed, Marcus and Sarah found themselves receiving numerous compliments about how well they had handled the earlier situation. Several couples shared their own wedding day disaster stories, and many people commented on how the brief crisis had actually made the ceremony feel more personal and authentic than many of the perfectly choreographed weddings they had attended. You know what I love about what happened today? Sarah's college roommate, Jennifer, told her during the reception. It showed everyone that you two are real people who can laugh at yourselves and work through problems together. That's exactly what marriage is about. Marcus spent much of the reception feeling grateful and somewhat amazed that what had seemed like a complete disaster had somehow transformed into something that enhanced rather than ruined their wedding day. The story of his laughing fit during the vows had already become a source of affectionate teasing among their friends, and he realized that Sarah's grandmother had been right. Sometimes the most memorable celebrations are the ones where something unexpected happens. During their first dance as a married couple, Sarah looked up at Marcus and said quietly, I'm actually glad that happened today." Marcus looked surprised. "Really? You're glad I had a hysterical breakdown during our wedding ceremony?" "I'm glad because it reminded me that marriage isn't about having a perfect wedding day," Sarah explained as they swayed to the music. "It's about finding someone who you can get through the imperfect moments with and still want to spend the rest of your life together. Plus," she added with a mischievous grin, "now I have the perfect story to embarrass you with at parties for the next 50 years. Marcus laughed and spun Sarah around on the dance floor. "I love you, Mrs. Thompson," he said when she came back into his arms. "I love you too, Mr. Thompson," Sarah replied, "even if you do have terrible judgment about gas station food choices." 3 months later, Marcus and Sarah were looking through their wedding photos and laughing at the pictures that had captured his breakdown at the altar. The photographer had continued taking pictures throughout the entire crisis, and the resulting images told the complete story of their wedding day: the beautiful beginning, the unexpected chaos, and the joyful conclusion. "Look at Danny's face in this one," Sarah said, pointing to a picture where Danny was clearly struggling not to laugh while Marcus was doubled over with hysteria. "He looks like he's trying to decide whether to help you or join in." "And look at your face in this one," Marcus replied, showing her a picture where she looked completely bewildered and concerned. "You look like you're wondering if you should call off the wedding or call for medical help." They had frames several of the photos from their wedding day, including one from the moment right after Pastor Williams pronounced them husband and wife. In that picture, both of them were laughing with pure joy and relief, and it perfectly captured the happiness they felt about having successfully navigated through their unexpected crisis together. "You know what's funny?" Sarah said as she looked at their wedding album. "I used to worry that you were too serious and planned everything too carefully to handle the unexpected challenges that life would throw at us. But watching you laugh hysterically during our wedding ceremony because of some ridiculous teenage memory actually convinced me that you have a great sense of humor and can roll with whatever happens." "Well," Marcus said, putting his arm around his wife, "I'm glad my public humiliation served some useful purpose. Plus, now whenever we're going through a difficult time in our marriage, I can just whisper gas station sushi and make you laugh," Sarah added. Marcus groaned. "I knew I was going to regret telling you that story." "Are you kidding?" Sarah said, kissing him on the cheek. "That story is the best wedding gift you could have given me. It's the perfect reminder that even when things don't go according to plan, we can still end up exactly where we're supposed to be." 5 years later, Marcus and Sarah were telling the story of their wedding day to their friends at a dinner party, and it had become one of their favorite anecdotes to share. They had developed it into a perfectly choreographed routine, with Sarah setting up the story and Marcus delivering the punchline about the gas station sushi with impeccable timing. And that's how I learned that my husband's one weakness is his inability to resist questionable convenience store food, Sarah concluded, causing their dinner guests to laugh appreciatively. In my defense, Marcus added, I was 17 and nervous. My decision-making abilities were severely compromised. And that's how I learned that my wife can handle absolutely anything, Marcus said, looking at Sarah with obvious affection, including a groom who has hysterical breakdowns during wedding ceremonies. Their friends always loved hearing the story, and many couples had told them that it had helped them realize that the most important thing about a wedding day isn't having everything go perfectly according to plan, but being able to laugh together when things inevitably go wrong. The funny thing is, Sarah often said when telling the story, people always ask me if I was upset that our perfect wedding ceremony got ruined. But the truth is, it became perfect precisely because it didn't go according to plan. It showed us exactly who we are together. People who can get through anything as long as we're honest with each other and maintain our sense of humor. And every year on their wedding anniversary, Danny would call Marcus and start the conversation by saying, remember junior year when you got food poisoning from that gas station sushi? Causing Marcus to laugh just as hard as he had during their wedding ceremony, though this time Sarah was always laughing right along with him. The story of Marcus Thompson's wedding day had become family legend, passed down to their children and grandchildren as the perfect example of how sometimes the most beautiful moments in life are the ones that don't go according to plan. It had taught them that love isn't about finding someone who never embarrasses you, but about finding someone who can embarrass themselves completely and still trust that you'll love them anyway. And every time Marcus passed a gas station with a prepared food section, he would remember that terrible homecoming night that had somehow led to the best moment of his adult life. The day he married Sarah, while laughing so hard he could barely breathe, surrounded by everyone they loved, creating a memory that was infinitely more precious than any perfectly planned ceremony could have been. Because sometimes the moments that seem like complete disasters become the foundations of the most beautiful stories we ever get to tell.